Hi there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. This week, I'm still in Brooklyn. It's still winter, but the end of my time in the US is coming to an end. By the end of the month, I'll be back in Ghana. Hooray! But this week, I'm doing a little bit of a sneak preview of Journeys Back to Africa with a longtime friend. My guest this week was born in Illinois to immigrants from Rwanda and Uganda. She is an acclaimed vocalist and songwriter. She's built her career on transatlantic sonicism, I love that word, and storytelling. Her latest album, Holy Room, live at Alte Oper with Frankfurt Radio Big Band, this is Salon Africana 2020, was recorded in an 18th century German opera house in May 2019 and is currently nominated for, wait for it, a 2021 Grammy Award for Best Jazz Vocal Album. Somi is a Soros Equality Fellow, a USA Doris Duke Fellow, a TED Senior Fellow, an inaugural Association of Performing Arts Presenters Fellow, a former artist in residence at the Park Avenue Armory, UCLA Center for the Art of Performance, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the Baryshnikov Art Center. She is also the founder of Salon Africana, a boutique arts agency and record label that celebrates the very best of contemporary African artists working in the music and literary arts. Somi, welcome to the podcast. What a wonderful bio. I love reading bios that are so acclaimed.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's just jump right in. So I always like to start with my question, which is, where are you from? Where are you local? And what is your craft?
So where am I from? I always identify sort of as a hyphenated person. So I'm Rwandan, Ugandan, American. I'm from in the US. I would claim Illinois as where I grew up, but I've lived in New York for a number of years and recently moved to Georgia, to Atlanta. So I'm a New Yorker, Harlemite, Midwesterner, East African, but also lived in Lagos for a while as a musician, a global citizen. So
okay, of course. But can I say thank you for being an Atlantan right now?
Hey,
thank you.
I got to vote.
She got to vote. She got to put some roots down in a place where we definitely needed every vote to count. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. So tell us more about your background and your inspiration.
My background, I was born in the United States when my father was doing his postdoc at the University of Illinois in veterinary medicine. And we were here for about 3 years. Then we moved to Zambia for a while. He was with WHO. We moved. My father is originally from Rwanda. My mother is originally from Uganda. They met in Kenya and then met again in London. And then the rest is history. And so we moved to Zambia and then came back to the States when I was 8 years old, and where he took up a professorship in Illinois. And that became where I spent most of my formative years. End of primary school and all of my secondary school education was in the States, in Illinois. After college, I moved to Kenya and Tanzania for a while, for about a year and a half. When I thought I was going to be a medical anthropologist, I was there kind of exploring certain things.
Okay. I never knew that about you.
Yeah. Which to me is very much the same thing, as singing.
Okay. Oh, you'll have to tell us more about that.
Yeah, because basically, you're looking at cultural modes of healing. And to me, it's very connected to what I do as an artist, or I try to do as an artist, or at least what it's done for me, I should say, as an artist.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
So after that time in East Africa, I moved to New York. And ever since then, I have been pursuing a career in the arts as a musician, as a composer, and as a writer, performer. Mm-hmm. More hyphens.
Right,
but,
of course.
But yeah, that's what I've been doing. To answer your first question, which is what is your craft? So I'm an artist, mostly as a musician, but really a song maker and a storyteller.
Awesome. So Somi, what was your first language?
My first language was English. My parents were from two different tribes, and did not speak each other's tongues, respective tongue. So they spoke in English, which was what people spoke in Uganda and Kenya, and obviously in England. And we grew up speaking that. But I speak my mom's language. I shouldn't say I speak it fluently, but I understand it most. And I would say that's because she was the one at home speaking more of it. And my father was, even though he was a scientist, he was very much a linguist naturally. So he really picked up her language fluently, And so at some point, they were mostly communicating in her language, around us more so than in.
So that's what you heard.
That's what I heard more of, But really, as a Mnyarwanda, as being his daughter, where I'm from, you kind of follow your father's line. And so technically I should speak Kinyarwanda fluently, but unfortunately I do not. So English was my first language, but I grew up kind of hearing that. And I've studied Swahili, and I can understand a great deal of the language, but I can't unfortunately speak either fluently.
Okay. Well, understanding is half the battle.
It is.
Yeah, because secrets are passed just in hearing half the time.
Right.
So
that's right. Very
exactly.
True.
Yeah. So you want to be a medical anthropologist, but has music always been part of who you were? Like, did you sing in the choir? Did you play instruments? How did music become your identity?
Yeah, music, I would say yes. It's always been a part of my life, but I'm not one of those artists who kind of came up like knowing this is the thing and doing all the things that kind of prepared them for this professional moment in their lives. I think that's twofold. One is because one of the reasons is the fact that as a child of immigrants or African parents and people who kind of coming from perhaps a more conservative background, being an artist wasn't really something that I thought I could do. I didn't know it was something I'd be even allowed to do, and I didn't really see professional artists around me personally. I only saw people in academia and medicine and, those sorts of fields. And so I didn't really I didn't know that it was an option. I thought of it as like a way to be well-rounded. So, but when I think about who I was as a child, and even when my mother tells the story, she's like, oh, she was always singing, But when I think about who I was, especially when we were in Zambia, I was that person who was I was that girl who was always in all the plays, the musicals, always, going for the lead and doing all these things and really wanting to storytell, to be a storyteller, to play out these stories that I would come up with myself or that were, being told to me. And then there was this shift that happened when we moved back to the United States, where we were in a predominantly white community. There's a lot of ignorance around Africa in the 80s, a lot of ignorance. Also from teachers who really I dealt with a lot of racism, and I really I went through this period of quietude in a way, not socially, but like where I wasn't really comfortable sharing my voice. I had a very strong British accent back then. I really was trying not to be the other person in the room, capital O other person in the room,
Right.
And I think there was a silencing that happened, and there was a discomfort that they had with dealing, with seeing a confident Black girl child, knowing themselves, knowing their heritage, I recall a number of kind of small confrontations that I would have with those teachers, and not in a in the way that you just question, but why, as a child who's been told that it's okay to ask these questions, or it's to know that to have parents who have allowed me to be a whole person, right? And to express myself in a whole way. And then somebody trying to quieten that down. So, we were trained to ask questions if somebody's telling you can't do something, not because it's disrespectful, but because for their own reason. And so I remember a lot of those questions. I remember a lot of those kind of altercations and that kind of tension that was always sort of present, that really, I think of it as there was a silencing that happened whether I was performing or even reading, my stories. I used to write a lot also as a child. And I remember when I think back to it now, I know it was just coming from a place of their own insecurity and their own racism and prejudice. But at the time I didn't understand it. So, as a child, you start to think, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong. And then you can't really question because they're older than you. And there's all this stuff, but you're questioning, but then the responses are leaving you with more questions. So you're like,
right.
So I feel like I went through a stretch really of silencing. And so at that point, I stopped using my voice and I started studying the cello.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, I remember just feeling as though I always think about that moment as my way of still being connected to something that gave me a great amount of joy, which was music, but not having to speak, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so I did that
How long did you play cello?
really through university.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
And it wasn't until I went to Kenya and Tanzania, that was like the first time that I had been without my
Without it.
instrument. Yeah.
Wow.
Since I was about 8. Yeah. And so then I would say it was that time and I'll tell you that in undergrad, I studied cultural anthropology and African studies. Those were my majors. And when I went to Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, I remember just going and being able to kind of lay down a lot of romanticism that shows up when you've been raised away from home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I really wanted to understand home for myself, not these sort of touch and go holiday experiences of it that I used to have. You know, the times that we were fortunate enough to go home which wasn't that often, frankly, growing up because there were a lot of kids and it was just far and it was the 80s in Uganda was very unstable, very rare. And so when I finally was at a point that I could just be in East Africa from my own point of view, my own experiences. And that's why I chose Kenya and Tanzania, which was next door. So I could dip home and see family
and not feel,
but like really wanted it to be my own experience, you know?
Yeah.
And I think what that time gave me, it gave me an opportunity to understand, release that romanticism, but also kind of come to terms with this American identity that I had been shrugging away. Like I'd been shoving away from myself for a long time. I'd been like, you know, who would I have been had I been raised back home? Like I was constantly like trying to get back to like who I was, you know. I was just always this like culturist, you know. That's why I think in college, that's why I was studying those things. You know, I was always in pursuit of
And I have a feeling your studies brought that out of you as well, because you were looking into these lives of different, you know, time periods and different cultures. And you're like, oh, well that speaks to me. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps. I mean, I think I chose that line of studying because identity was always a question. Even from high school, it was a big question in my heart. You know, it was really like the importance of identity, the importance of heritage, I mean, I remember we'd go to these annual it was called Ugandan North American Association.
Yeah, we all have them.
And I remember giving an impassioned speech when I was like 16 about we need to have culture camp and we need to da-da-da-da. I mean, like, so I was already that person.
Sure.
And so when I discovered cultural anthropology, I was like, oh my God, these are all those questions, you know?
Yeah.
And obviously African studies, you know, for my own kind of personal heritage. And so after that, it was just the whole journey had been moving towards the continent. And once I was on the continent, I realized certain parts of myself that I shouldn't discard, like who I am as an American, because I'm both. And so I think really was this opportunity to kind of heal that, like that sort of what I felt as though was some kind of fracture of the cultural self, you know? And so it really gave that sense of peace. I talk about it all the time. It sounds kind of cliche, but this notion of when you know where you're from, you know where you want to go. And so after that year, suddenly having a sense of peace about where I was from and how I kind of could position myself in an African context, it gave me a lot of clarity about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And to me, that was totally 100% towards music. And it's almost like, oh, that larger question has been somehow resolved, which is like, what is the next question I have? And it was like, well, what's the other thing in my heart? And suddenly it was just so clear, you know, that it was going to be music. And that's when really my journey began with, you know, moving to New York and deciding to pursue music. And
Sure. So you played music before, but then you are a singer right? So you came into a vocalist, right? So then how did you find that voice? How did you refine that voice? So you had this discovery, you decided you're leaving, but how did the vocalist in you reemerge?
Well, I'd say a few things. Therapy.
Okay.
When you've like literally like kept something inside of you.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
breaking open, you know, and
Yes.
therapy, I was saying it in jest, but I say it in the sense of like the music really was a way of like me just deciding to commit to exploring my voice. That was sort of a journey, a therapeutic journey, right? Because there's this release, there's this catharsis, there's this breaking open, there's this exploration of emotions that you don't really realize have been inside of you, right? That's what I believe the voice did for me, at least. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I really just decided to study and to understand the voice as an instrument, to understand the technical side of things that support producing sound. And yeah, it was really about just deciding to study and deciding to, you know, take risks, really.
Sure. And so you took a very professional route, basically. So you studied, you know, learned the craft in another way, as opposed to just kind of finding it in practice. Practice, of course, but you actually really studied music and studied voice through classes, through institutions.
Mostly private teachers.
Okay.
I did end up going back to graduate school in a field called performance studies, which is sort of an anthropological look at performance. It's again kind of coming from a social science side of things, not a studio program, as they're called. It's not a class it's not a track that's about technique. So most of my teachers were private teachers. I don't have a music degree. I have other degrees from social science.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay. So you took a journey to Africa, you came back and you were reborn. And so, so this is where I ask my guests to tell me why the where. How did you come to be living, working, and playing where you live and where you have lived? So where you live now and maybe where you have lived in the past.
Well, again, just, you know, as you know, I just recently moved to Atlanta literally a few weeks ago. So just shy of 2 months ago. So I can't speak to, you know, what it is here, but why I chose Atlanta. I chose it because it's probably the closest one can get to an African city in this country, predominantly Black, predominantly Black, and a lot of Black wealth and intellectual kind of communities that are, you know, are here. So, and culture. It's an industry city as well. So it's kind of emerged in the last 10 years as a Black Hollywood, but it's also historically been really an important music city as well. So that's quite thrilling. And so I chose it to be close to that because I thought that I would be able to move, you know, if not to LA, then I was very strongly looking at trying to live on the continent. And I think what I realized is, you know, Atlanta is a kind of a happy medium, at least for now during COVID-19. You know, it feels good. It's also the cost of living is amazing. And it's still close to a lot of dear family and New York City, which is where I've called home for longer than I'll say. But a long time. So Harlem, I lived in Brooklyn and in Harlem. And I was there because, you know, New York City, I'd always dreamed of living there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, why don't we all want to live in New York?
Right. People ask me, I'm like, well, I visited and I knew I needed to live there. That's why.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a center for all cultural, you know, energy and inspiration. And, you know, I'll say the one thing I always love about New York is it doesn't matter any day of the week, you can wake up and decide you're going to see world-class art in any discipline, in any genre, and you can find it like top of the highest levels. And casually in the park, on the street, in the subway, or like, you know, in the museums, in the theaters, on the stages. So it's just a feast of culture.
Yeah.
And that to me is everything. I can't get that anywhere else. So, you know, right now that's obviously not the case in New York because of COVID and obviously not the case here either. But I feel as though we have a lot to look forward to beyond COVID because I just know myself and just the arts community, we're like, you know, dying to get back on stage, you know? So it's, you know, people keep talking about the roaring 20s, the rebirth of that, you know, like that we had after the last pandemic. And so I think that we're going to really see that in the years ahead. It's going to be a party, a global rave. Right.
So speaking of, you know, your industry during this time, what are some of your colleagues, your peers? How are you all communing? How are you surviving? How are you making it during this time?
Well, I think that there's a range, everybody's dealing with it in different ways. So I'll speak to how I'm dealing with it. I think most people are trying to stay creative because that's what gives us strength. And it's also how we move through all of our emotions, how we process our emotions and the life that we live and the lives around ours. So I would say for myself, the first 8 months of COVID, I was with my mom. I went to Illinois to make sure she wasn't alone, not realizing that it was going to end up being this long of a stretch. I would have probably made the same decision even if I did know that. But I think having that chance to have that sustained time with family was a real gift. I think most people probably would agree with that. It's been a real gift to have that kind of sustained time with loved ones. But I also think for me, it's been really important to stay creative. So I released that live album that you mentioned earlier, really as a way to stay connected to the thing that makes me feel most alive, which is when I'm on stage and performing, when I listen to the sound of, public assembly, of congregation, it was like, wow, that sounds just so far away from where we are right now, and it really helped me think about the room and to think about, but more specifically, it made me I had a visceral, energetic response to it in a way that made me think about the fact that there's nothing else that gives that to me. There's nothing else that can make me feel that. And so I really released that as an offering to myself, as a way to stay connected to that, and also as an offering to those who've supported my journey and those who are longing to return to those sort of two cultural spaces, and also as an homage to the cultural spaces around the world, the stages, the theaters that have fallen silent in the midst of this pandemic. There's something really tragic about that. If you think about the sound of silence, it's pretty heartbreaking sound or idea that all of these stages are sitting in darkness right now. And it's also an offering it's also meant to be a meditation on what we hold to be. The album is called Holy Room. So it's really also this meditation on what we believe is sacred space. I mean, at the top of the pandemic, suddenly it was like our home, like where we took refuge, that was our sacred space. Like, how do we keep this place safe? Right. So it was really this meditation on what spaces we deem to be holy, and whether that's a stage or our mothers or, just a private garden or friendships or whatever it might be, so it's really meant to be this kind of larger meditation. And so for me, that was the intention of the project, but it was also, frankly, it ended up being some way for me to keep myself occupied and very busy. To be thinking about a release and a project, very different from the year I had planned, but it's definitely a gift. So it's been about making art, I think, is what most of us are doing. I also made an experimental art film called In the Absence of Things, which is also about the feeling that we have, like how I've been trying to come to grips with, like, who am I in the absence of the stage, of the living stage? Who am I in the absence of song for somebody other than myself? So it's been interesting, but I think the short answer is we all are making art to stay encouraged. And
connected in some ways, because I think that there's this whole new way that people are connecting and engaging on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. I would also say that one of the gifts of this sort of sustained stretch of stillness and quietude has been, even just releasing the record. I released it independently as my first independent release in a long, long time.
Nice.
It allowed me,
and it got nominated. What? Sorry, not to interrupt you. Yes.
No, but I think, it's also been an opportunity to look at what this digital era actually presents to artists, right? Like, what are these tools that are really available? The marketing tools, social media tools, all of the things that I often feel like I don't ever have the time to try to figure out for myself, which is why you end up being with a label, being with whoever, where they have people who are focused on that. And so with all of this time, it's allowed me to actually learn that and to kind of go into the back end of things and be like, oh, this is why this works. And this is why these analytics, and this is why, even understanding the Grammys process in a different way, or understanding like there's so many different things that allow us to be more prepared for opportunity and hopefully exponentially reap the rewards of that preparedness, So that's been great to really lean into infrastructure and understanding of the back end of the business in a way that I haven't had the time to do in a very long time.
Right. So, but I think before the pandemic, you had something huge planned already. So you were planning to open your first play. And so that, was entirely put on hold. And so tell us more about, because that required, you were producer, right? And you were part of the talent. So you were already in the back end. So tell us a little bit more about that process, how you came to that project, and tell us the name of the project.
Sure. So the project is called Dreaming Zenzile. It is a play about the great Miriam Makeba. For those who might not know who she is, it's the South African singer, activist, the late, great First Lady of African Song, Mama Africa, as people belovedly call her, or lovingly call her. I would say that I came to playwriting or theater making, because I'd say the last 7 to 8 years, the way I would curate an album was always it was always curated as these song cycles where it's like one theme and then everything is sort of around that theme. So when I moved to Lagos, Nigeria, for example, the Lagos Music Salon was very much about the stories of my journey in Lagos, right? And everything was about that place. My last record before this live record was called Petite Afrique, and it was about African immigrants in the Petite Afrique, the African quarter in Harlem in New York City. And so every time in this sort of deep dive, when I realized I really love this sort of anthropological, to bring it back to the earlier work, because I realized after this work began, people started saying, oh, this feels very ethnographic, like there's an ethnographic approach to your research. And I wasn't trying to do it, but it was actually kind of a wonderful moment for me when people started feeling that, because then I was like, oh, I'm finally actually using your technical training. Yeah. So that's been cool. But I would say, it is very much about that kind of, how does place inform identity, right? How does place inform personhood? And so, which I think is an interesting thing to consider, even just thinking about the theme of this podcast, right? This idea of where we're from and how that informs how we see the world, live in the world, experience the world. And so that's very much, I think, what I'm always in pursuit of, these kind of ordinary experiences that we have as African people or as Black people in the world, but how that informs this sort of larger, how those ordinary things actually speak this much larger and complex range of humanity of our, the humanity of ourselves. And so I think essentially in writing those song cycles, essentially I was asking people to step into a world, step into Lagos and travel through all of these stories with me, step into Harlem and travel through all of these stories with me. And so in a way, that's what the world of theater does, right? It asks you to step into a world for a stretch of time. And so what I realized is I really was trying to create this multidimensional kind of space, and I realized that there's something that's not multidimensional enough for me about songs. Songs are often ephemeral, or they are ephemeral. They can be incredibly deep and vast and, move people, and you can listen to something on repeat for a month and want to just live in that place. But I think what I was interested in, how can I make these stories or that world of Lagos or that world of Harlem, how can I make that a more dimensional experience for people, and that's the magic of theater for me, is you get to really intentionally step into the world, beyond these ephemeral sort of fleeting things that you have to kind of string together in stories between the songs, which I would do anyway. But I realized I just wanted to really build a world, I guess is the point. So I think that's one side of how I came to writing a play, but because I think I was on that journey anyway. But in terms of this particular play, Miriam Makeba is, as I said earlier, the first lady of African song. And it is, to me, quite tragic that she's not exalted in the way that she should be. I'm often shocked, but actually maybe not anymore, but I'm often shocked by the number of people who aren't familiar with her.
Sure.
A lot of people from her generation and young generation now. And Africans and non-Africans. It was always quite surprising to me. But then it speaks to this kind of violent cultural erasure that she went through when she married Stokely Carmichael at the height of the civil rights movement. And Stokely Carmichael, as you know, was a part of the Black Panther Party. And so they were essentially, after she was in exile from South Africa, she was blacklisted in the United States, and her career was literally taken from her overnight. I mean, she went from being this huge, huge star to they just took it away from her. They were like, you can't be married to this person who is, in that. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And think you can just be in the US, on our radio stations and and it was, so they shut it down and they left, they moved to West Africa. But she had an extraordinary, she sang at John F. Kennedy's birthday, same one that Marilyn Monroe sang at. She was, best friends with Nina Simone. She was, moving around. Harry Belafonte brought her over here. She was on the cover of Time magazine in her first month of the country. I mean, there's so many things. She was friends with Marlon Brando, like just an extraordinary, extraordinary, extraordinary life. She was married to Hugh Masekela. She was, I said, married to Stokely Carmichael. Just an extraordinary, extraordinary life. And literally that decision to marry a man whose fight was the same as her own fight in South Africa. Mm-hmm. That choice, her career completely disappeared, which of course wasn't like, it's not like she had regret. She's never, at least the literature I've read, the letters I've read, the books I've read, and the conversations I've had, there's never a moment that she expresses regret, right? Because it's the same fight. Mm-hmm. So, but what happened is, it wasn't until the 1980s with Paul Simon, Graceland Tour, when people were like, oh my God, Miriam Makeba. Yeah. When she kind of came back, I'd say, into public consciousness in the US. Mm-hmm. But in Europe, Latin America, and even on the continent in Africa, people love her. Yeah, that's true. I mean, Germany, there are streets, schools named after Miriam Makeba. It's amazing. I find it really interesting. It's specifically in the United States. So this work is very much about undoing the silence that shrouds her legacy. It's just trying to offer some sort of homage to the woman, the person who I believe really made room for anybody, any African artist operating on the global cultural stage is indebted to Miriam Makeba because she was the first. And so it's really meant to honor her, dreaming Zenzile. And Zenzile is her first true name, her true first name, which means you have done it to yourself. Okay. Anyway, I can that part I could go on and on and on. So let's roll it in. We're looking forward to when that can be seen on stage because it sounds like a beautiful offering. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit and let me ask my Glocal Speak question. So this is where I ask what you hear. I like to ask you to share a word, phrase, or saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience and why or how you came to value it as Glocal Speak. Well, the phrase that comes to mind, I mean, I won't speak on behalf of Georgia. Okay. It's too new. Too new. But the phrase that comes to mind that I love is turi kumwe, which in Kinyarwanda means we are together. Okay, say it again. Turi kumwe. There's something about, I don't even know how to, I mean, we are together is literal, but I don't know how to, the literal translation doesn't really do it justice, although I still think that's quite poetic. Often. But just this notion of solidarity, community, love, friendship, family. I mean, it expresses so many things and it can be said in such a casual way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it represents a certain type of togetherness, like we are together, but it's, I don't know if that's deeper than that, but I get it. No, because my last guest, she said something in Italian. There are so many expressions that don't have direct translations into English because English seems like, I feel like there's no expression in English that people can't make a direct translation for somehow. But somehow these other languages that have words that are more sentimental, I guess, that just encompass a real spirit more so than just the word or the symbolic nature of it. I think that it's just interesting. That's why I love language. I always like to ask people questions about language. So I like that. We are together. Yeah. Which is how many syllables was that? That's like 3 syllables. 4 syllables. Yeah. Oh, okay. So it's not the same.
Okay, that's a nice one. So let me ask another, kind of getting back into the freestyle of what you're doing and trends, motivations, all those things. You work with a group of people. So, being an artist, you have to lead and bring people together. Tell us more about your experience with working with different musicians and how you've come to put together your band, because your band is phenomenal. I love them. They're wonderful. How did you all come together as one?
Sure. Well, firstly, I'll say I miss them dearly. They happen to listen to this because, we haven't played in so long now. But how did we come together? Every single member, I'll say that firstly, everybody was like, I met them in different ways through different people. Sometimes I saw somebody perform, and sometimes I was just mentioning to a friend, oh, I'm looking for this type of person, or I need this in the band. And they'd be like, oh, I saw this one guy play the other night, or I know this person. So I'm really, really fortunate that a lot of my band members, we've been playing together for so long, we really have grown up in the business together. Mm-hmm. So that's a joy. They're really, really family to me. And yeah, I was reflecting on that today with a musician friend in South Africa about this musician community. It really is a family, So I would say, and I say that it's a bit profound only because we're always traveling and on the road, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't always see each other that often, but there's real love, even those of us who don't perform together, but we get to see each other passing at a festival or in a club in the city, or, just they really,
the kinship really of song.
Yeah, or just of art,
Of art, yeah.
So I'll speak about two of my band members who are on my latest record, Holy Room, because two of them accompanied me there, Hervé Samb and Toru Dodo. Toru Dodo is Japanese. He's a pianist, came from Tokyo to study at Berkeley in Boston, moved to New York. I met him. I mentioned to a friend of mine, whom you know, Jeremiah. I mentioned to him years ago, like, oh, I really need to find a great pianist. I just haven't been able to find the right pianist for my band. He was like, I saw this amazing guy the other night. I took his card. Do you want to call him? Also, when we were just so young and new in New York, so you don't really have that. Like now, if somebody's like, pianist, I have like a list of people that
because I remember your music before your band now, so that's why I'm like, this you're now, it's awesome. Yeah, we go back.
So I was like, okay, and I called him, and he's such a wonderful, first of all, incredible musician, so humble, and just so gifted. Like,
yeah.
So anyway, that's how I met Toru. And he is my brother. We've been playing together for a long time. So definitely this moment, this nomination for both he and Hervé, the other person, I really celebrated with them, because they've been on this journey with me. Hervé is originally from Senegal, based in Paris, was in New York one day. Do you remember the Zinc Bar when we used to go to African nights on Fridays? Anyway, so there was always an African band, or, on Friday nights, Kaisa Dumbe was singing, and these different players from mostly Cameroon were performing. And it was just a vibe. And one night I was there, and this young guitarist just was killing it. And I was like, he was playing all this jazz, and I was like, who are you? So I was like, hey, who are you? And I just literally, that was probably what are you doing? Like, who are you? What are you doing here? I'd never seen an African musician play jazz that well, and play the African music that well.
Sure.
So I was like, who are you? And by African, I'm just saying of like contemporaries, young people in the, in the mix, not like Mazakila and Abdullah and all those people. I'm saying like youngins, people who might be able to be in my band.
Right.
So I was like, hey, I've got a show next month at the Blue Note. It was my very first show there. I was like, are you going to be in town? He was like, no, but I could come back. And so began and he's never lived in New York, and Hervé and I played together all over the world all the time. Yeah. And so the two of them, they're my brothers. I mean, I can speak about all of the band, but like, I'll say those two because we've played together the longest. And because they're also a part of this record. And so I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. I just, I'm always curious about that. And then speaking of other musicians, you mentioned Hugh Masekela. You had I remember I got to meet Uncle Hugh with you. And where were we? Were we in Nigeria? Because, we first met in Nigeria and then we met again in Ghana. Because he was, yes. So there was always special times rolling with Somi from Nigeria. But so tell us how, because he was definitely someone that was very special to you. Tell us how you came to be close with Uncle Hugh.
Yeah, I met him in Brooklyn. Okay. I had been to a couple of his concerts, but the first time I met him was in 2006. He was performing at Celebrate Brooklyn. Okay. No, 2005. Performing at Celebrate Brooklyn. And I went, a friend of mine came. I had just moved to Harlem, like literally just before that. And I had also just started grad school. It was just like, and my friend was like, Nana. I was like, oh, he must kill it. And I remember I came down from Harlem and I was like, feeling very stressed about getting back uptown to finish some work and get home before it's dark and all this stuff. And there was this long line to meet him after he had given this incredible concert. And I remember I was very like on the fence of like, if I stay, am I going to get home too late? And I remember she was just like, just stay. You know, I had my demo with me.
Yeah.
And
always a cheerleader. I love Nana. Yes.
And so I stayed, and he had just come back from Uganda. I remember I'd been reading about it in the Ugandan press that he had been given a huge show there as a fundraiser for an orphanage in Kampala. And so there was this young man, Lucky, who used to work at Madiba in
I remember Lucky.
He was like, he saw us, he waves us to the front. He's like, oh, okay, great. So we get up there and he's like, where are you from? It's the first thing he says, because it's these two African women, and tell him. And he's like, oh, I was just in Uganda. I was like, I know. And anyway, so he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a singer. And I said, I actually have a demo that I'd love to give you a CD. If you have any moment to listen to it, I would appreciate it. This thing we used to have to do. Anyway, so he said, I promise I'll listen to it. And I said, okay. And he was just so lovely. I think the thing I love about Uncle Hugh is he was disarming, with everybody he met. Just so much love. So much love. And so I said, okay. And about 6 months later, I was in Niger, I remember, and internet was so dodgy. And anyway, so I went and I had this email that showed up from his daughter, Pula, who worked with him in his office, and who's now a very dear sister and friend. She was like, I'm writing on behalf of Hugh Masekela, and he would love to meet with you. He's going to be in New York, and this and this. And so began our friendship. He became my greatest mentor, and just, decided that I had something to offer, and was just really, I moved to Lagos after a conversation with him. First time I performed in Carnegie Hall was because he invited me to step on stage. Anyway, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's hard for me to talk about. So, yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So let me move on to my mindset hack. So this is where I ask what your favorite or an innovative mindset hack is. So this is one that you can imagine or one that you know of.
I would say music is my hack to centeredness, if we can talk about that as a mindset. I think for me, if I feel centered, I can kind of do anything.
Yeah.
Or I feel like I can do anything. So,
of course.
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of things. I meditate every morning, which helps me even when I don't feel like it. If I can just take a moment and meditate, and, just it brings me back to center. And then music. Sometimes after a meditation, I might be like, okay, I'm in the right place. But in order for me to really get into a zone, and I've known this like even in college, like if I needed to get something done, I would just literally put in headphones and
yeah.
Which is interesting because it's certain tasks. I feel like as I become a professional musician, I can't listen to it all. It depends on what the task it has to be like, it has to be music that doesn't make me think too much, right? Like It doesn't ask me to pay attention to it, if you will.
Sure.
But the music I always have on, like I probably listen to it a couple times a week, is Miles Davis' Kind of Blue.
Okay. That's a good one.
Which not to say that it doesn't make you think, but it puts you in a mood. And because perhaps I know the music so well that I'm not taken to like, oh, that's a new note. You know, I'm like,
right.
I'm kind of blue, you know?
Right. Exactly. So speaking of music then, what are you listening to these days besides your own, who are some of the artists that you, and I say that in the context of you have this wonderful Salon Africana, which is a showcase in many ways. I've been to many of your talks and you've highlighted so many artists from around Africa. Who are some of the up and coming musicians that you've been listening to and artists that you highlight in your work?
Okay, through Salon Africana, I would say there are a few. I mean, I really, really love the scene in South Africa.
Okay.
I know we've been talking about South Africans quite a bit, it seems, on this call, but there's I think it's hugely because they have a long-standing jazz tradition of their own.
Right.
So I feel it feels like a very easy feeling of home there. You know, I feel very understood artistically there in a way that I don't think the scenes are as robust or even the audiences are as robust in other African countries or cities.
I would agree.
So there's extraordinary musicianship and artistry there. But that isn't to say that, like, I mentioned Hervé. Hervé has an amazing, in my band, Hervé Sam, the guitarist, he has an incredible group out of Dakar. Their whole thing is about creating a Senegalese approach to jazz music. His last record called Jazz Sabar.
Jazz
Sabar.
Okay.
There is, but out of South Africa, I'll say Msaki. It's an amazing vocalist. Zoe Modicha, great vocalist and guitarist. Nduduzo Makatini, pianist, who just became the first Africa-based artist signed to the historic Blue Note Records here in New York. I would say Julia Sarr from Senegal. Beautiful vocalist. I mean, there's so many. I feel terrible if I don't say certain names because then I know.
But this is a good list. Our show notes for this podcast are wonderful. So I like to put those down and then refer people to your site because you're always putting new people on and even in your socials. So it's all love.
Okay.
It's all love. Okay. Well, Somi, this has been a wonderful time spent together.
Yes,
thank you so much. Thank you. So before we sign off, I always like to ask, I ask about music, but I know you're also a big reader and maybe a little more to a reader. So tell us, what are you reading these days? Or what are some of the best reads you've come across in your reading days?
Wow. Prepared. I would say, what am I reading right now? I'm reading a lot of books on color therapy.
Oh, okay. Okay. As I look at you in a bright pink sweater and teal, would you call your walls teal or just turquoise?
They are teal.
Yeah. Beautiful teal walls. So yes, color therapy. So tell us more.
In this camera. Color therapy and about how they're connected to our chakras. And, I think I've always believed in color therapy, but I feel like I went through a stretch of years. Maybe this is just the New Yorker in me. I don't know. I went through a stretch of years where I was always buying black, which felt very counter to who I am. Like I was always drawn to brighter colors. Anyway, this isn't so much about books, but the point is people should explore and discover color therapy because I think it really does change energy. And I just think it's really important right now when we're inside our own spaces.
Yeah.
Now when we can't journey. So I think in order to kind of activate different types of energy privately, to consider color therapy or color energy. Let's say that color energy. That's what I'm reading about, color energy. Favorite books. I mean, I love Toni Morrison so much. I love Edwidge Danticat so much. I love Chimamanda Adichie so much. So I would say, and I guess I'm also reading some books I've recently read Poor Dad, Rich Dad for the first time.
Okay. An old classic. Yeah.
I'm currently reading Start Late, Finish Rich.
Okay. Right. So you got to get those hustles on. So I don't know. Okay, that's a good variety.
It's a good variety.
Good month-long reading exploration on recommendation. Okay, so any last words for our listeners today?
My last words. When is this going to air? If this is airing in 2021?
It is. It's airing in the next week or so.
Well, I would say to stay encouraged. I think a lot of I think the experience in COVID is very different on the continent, even though it's seeming to show up in other ways right now. Mm-hmm. But really, I would just be, telling everybody to stay encouraged. I'd love to tell everybody to stay encouraged and to connect with the thing that makes you feel most alive.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
As a way to move through this time. And I look forward to being together. I look forward to giving you a hug, Flo.
I know. I look forward to seeing you in Atlanta. I can't wait. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to those things. But yes. So Somi, thank you so much. So like I said, folks, we have wonderful, rich show notes. And please check out Somi's new album, A Holy Room, which is nominated for a Grammy. You can find it, please. Where should they buy it? Where can we buy it? Where's your site? Tell us your social. It'll be in the show notes, but tell us your socials.
Well, my website is somimusic.com. I think you can buy it there.
Yes.
But really, it's available anywhere. Bandcamp is where you can buy one of the limited physical copies. And otherwise, anywhere music is streamed or sold.
Mm-hmm.
Sold.
Exactly. Yes.
Amazon, where else? Oh, my socials are at Somi Music. So at SOMI Music.
Everything at Somi Music. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So folks, this has been another episode of the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. And my guest, I never said your full name. I feel so bad about it. My guest is Somi Kakoma. I love it. It's a song. It's such a song. Yes. So catch us each and every Tuesday with new episodes. You can catch us at www.glocalcitizenspod.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find us there. So please tell a friend, subscribe, listen in, share. And as always, bye for now.